From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Books and Beyond program. I'm Guy Leonard from the Center for the Book, and we're the section of the library that promotes books, reading, libraries, and literacy here in D.C. and also on a national basis. And one way we do this is through our state centers for the book. If you go to our website at read.gov, you can find your state's center for the book. There's one in every state. Another thing that we do is we provide the authors program for the National Book Festival, and this year we'll be having our 12th National Book Festival on September 22nd and 23rd. So if you happen to be in town that weekend, please join us. We'll have more than 100 authors this time, and they'll all be there talking about their books and signing their books as well. Just before we get started, I need to ask you to please turn off all your electronic devices, and I also need to let you know that we'll be filming this presentation for later webcasting on our website. So if you should ask a question at the end of the program, you'll be a part of the webcast. Our webcasts are all available. We have more than 200 of them online right now, and you can get those at read.gov. Today's author's book will be for sale, and it's for sale there at the back of the room here, and our author, Elizabeth Leonard, will be signing her work afterward, and this will also be a chance for you to talk to her again if you'd like to. We often get asked how we determine which books to feature in our author series, and the most important criterion we have is that the book must be based on research done here at the Library of Congress. And we learn of these books often through the various divisions in the library, including our co-sponsor today, which is the Manuscript Division. So I'd really like to thank the Manuscript Division for bringing this program to us, and thank you to Bruce Kirby, who's a reference librarian there, and he will introduce today's speaker. So please welcome Bruce Kirby.
Thanks, Guy. I also like to thank Ann Boney and her colleague John Cole from the Center of the Book, as well as Stacia Sestari for making this possible. As we observe the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, the Manuscript Division of the library is uniquely equipped to assist scholars in studying the conflict and its personalities. We hold the papers of Abraham Lincoln and several members of his cabinet, along with the papers of high military officials such as William T. Sherman, George McClellan, Jubal Early, and P.G.T. Beauregard. The division also holds the letters and diaries written by individual soldiers and civilians, and these provide perspectives on the Civil War experience from a cross-section of American society. As a reference librarian in the Manuscript Division, I have the pleasure of assisting historians, students, and authors as they conduct research in these rich collections. They spend long hours in the manuscript reading room, squinting at old letters, diaries, scrapbooks, and other primary material. Through a creative and intellectual process, they synthesize that material, place it into context, and tell a story. It's a special thrill when that story is published as a book. Dr. Elizabeth Leonard has spent enough time in the reading room in recent years to have developed a preference for a favorite table and a chair. I assume that chair is comfortable because she has sat there for many hours examining the papers of Joseph Holt. These consist of about 20,000 items in 117 containers. The first 90 or so of those containers are bound volumes of correspondence, which is arranged by date. There's no subject or name index, so to make sense of this mass of material, a scholar must simply sit down and begin reading and reading. Dr. Leonard is the John J. and Cornelia V. Gibson Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. She earned her master's and doctorate degrees in United States history at the University of California, Riverside. Her areas of expertise are U.S. history from 1780 to 1900, especially the Civil War era, and American women. Among her publications are works on gender issues during the Civil War and 19th century black soldiers. Some of these have been selected for the History Book Club, the Book of the Month Club, and the Quality Paperback Book Club. In 2004, W.W. Norton and Company published her book, Lincoln's Avengers, Justice, Revenge, and Reunion After the Civil War. This examined the effects that Lincoln's assassination and the subsequent trials of conspirators had on Reconstruction. Dr. Leonard's latest book, and the work that brings us here today, is Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt of Kentucky, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press last October. The book has recently been named a co-winner of the 2012 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. In its announcement, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History noted that Dr. Leonard provides a thorough biography of a man who played a role in 4 presidential administrations. She portrays Holt as an interesting personality with strengths, weaknesses, quirks, and integrity, and provides a new perspective on emancipation in Kentucky, as evidenced by Holt himself, a slave owner who later supported emancipation. The discussion of Holt's role as Judge Advocate General in the Lincoln administration provides information on Lincoln's wartime efforts regarding emancipation and civil liberties. Previous winners of the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize include Michael Burlingame, James McPherson, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Douglas Wilson, and David Donald. So she's in very esteemed company there. The Holt papers in the Manuscript division contain a striking document that I sometimes show to visitors. It's an elaborate, if mundane, form issued to Holt in January 1854 by the Kentucky Mutual Life Insurance Company. The form is titled Slave Policy, and it insures the life of a slave man named Sandy for a 6-month period during which he was employed on steamboats plying the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. It's a very striking document. Joseph Holt's evolution from a slaveholder who was protective of his property to an ally and an avenger of Abraham Lincoln should make an interesting story. We're fortunate to have Elizabeth Leonard to share it with us.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm just going to get some water. Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me here today. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm delighted to see so many of you here, and I hope it's just not just to get out of the heat. But if that's why you're here, that's okay too. The title of this talk is What's Been Forgotten About Lincoln's Forgotten Ally. And before I go into my formal remarks, I do want to say, and Bruce already sort of pointed this out, people often ask me, based on the title of this book, whether one of the reasons that Holt has been forgotten is that it's very hard to come up with material to understand who he was and what his life was like, what his work was like, and so on. And I say, well, that is one reason we can't use for why he's been forgotten, because there is so very much material here at the Library of Congress, not just in his papers, but this morning I was looking in the papers of Horatio King, who worked with him in the Postmaster's office, the Postmaster's Department, I should call it the Post Office Department in Buchanan's administration, and there is material from Holt in there too. There's material from Holt in the official records. There's material from Holt in other libraries. So it's everywhere, which raises interesting questions about why he has been forgotten. But what I want to talk about today is who he is and what I think is important about him that we've forgotten. So I'll start. In the introduction to this book, Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, which is, as you've heard, my new biography of Abraham Lincoln's Judge Advocate General, I boldly express my conviction that there is no member of Abraham Lincoln's administration or the post-war federal government, indeed no Civil War era figure, who has been more unjustly neglected by historians, more misrepresented by Americans' collective historical memory, and in the end more completely forgotten than Joseph Holt. Born in 1807 in tiny Stephensport, Kentucky, on the Ohio River, Joseph Holt, I write, spent his earliest years as the quiet, deeply reserved, but extremely bright and bookish second son of a slaveholding lawyer, farmer, and his wife. By the time he retired, however, Holt could look back on a professional life that included 3 decades as a highly accomplished, widely and deeply respected lawyer, orator, and Democratic Party activist in Kentucky and Mississippi, as well as 18 years of dedicated and important service in Washington, D.C., in conjunction with 4 consecutive presidential administrations. 12 of those 18 years he had spent as the Army's Judge Advocate General, first under Abraham Lincoln, then Andrew Johnson, and then Ulysses Grant. It is from this particular federal government position that Holt retired in 1875 at the age of 68. He then spent almost 20 more years in the nation's capital, living in the elegant New Jersey Avenue home near the Capitol building that he had purchased when he first moved to Washington in 1857 to become President James Buchanan's Commissioner of Patents. Unfortunately, that home no longer exists. I understand it was a truly splendid place, but it's no longer standing. Lincoln's forgotten ally, in essence, is a study of the long and remarkable journey that Joseph Holt made from Stephensport to Washington, and then back again many years later. For in 1894, Holt, who died at the age of 87, was buried in a small plot next to his family's home in Kentucky. His grave, with its magnificent marble headstone topped by a splendid carved eagle, is still there, as is the shell of the magnificent mansion his family once occupied. In my experience, scholars and others today who do recognize the name Joseph Holt associate him virtually entirely with the bitter aftermath of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. This is a connection that Robert Redford's deeply troubling April 2011 film, The Conspirator, has made even more indelible. In The Conspirator, actor Danny Huston's Holt appears unmistakably as a vengeful federal government operative who shamelessly and successfully schemes with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, played by Kevin Kline, to engineer the conviction of all 8 of the individuals who were arrested in connection with John Wilkes Booth's plot, regardless of the supposedly weak evidence against some of them, the purportedly questionable constitutionality of the court itself, and the judge's own request for clemency in the case of the one female defendant. It is certainly true that in April 1865, Joseph Holt was serving as Abraham Lincoln's Judge Advocate General and Chief of the Bureau of Military Justice. And in the wake of Lincoln's murder, Secretary Stanton handed over to Holt the responsibility of investigating the assassination and arresting, trying, punishing those who were implicated in it. It is also true that much, and perhaps most, of what has been written in the last century and a half about Holt's investigation and his management of the subsequent trial of the conspirators has depicted him in much the same manner as the film The Conspirator does, as a corrupt and vicious federal government prosecutor driven solely by the spirit of revenge against the South to punish any and all of the people who collaborated with Booth, as well as any others that he and the heartless Secretary of War personally, but perhaps wrongly, believed might be involved in Booth's conspiracy. The numerous individuals Holt supposedly targeted in this way included, of course, Mary Surratt, played in Robert Redford's film by Robin Wright, a poor Maryland-born widow whose only offense, this sort of depiction insists, was to be the loving and pious mother of one of the misguided conspirators, John Surratt, and the owner of a Washington, D.C. boarding house not far from Ford's Theater, where her son, Booth, and some of the others who ultimately came to trial had gathered to lay their ruthless plans. Holt's long list of targets also included many upon whom he never did get to exact the full measure of his revenge, hardly the least among them being the president of the vanquished Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. As hard as he tried, even allegedly to the extent of knowingly bribing a series of corrupt witnesses and actively suborning perjury, Holt never did prove that Davis was guilty. Ironically, this fact itself has been deployed as evidence to support the image of Davis as some sort of victim of Yankee and specifically radical Republican cruelty and malice, though Holt was a Southerner and a lifelong Democrat, rather than as he should be depicted, in my mind, as the deposed leader of a bloody but failed attack on the nation's life. Well, this is the slice of Holt's 87-year-long life that people claim to remember when they remember him at all, and this is generally how they remember him. Certainly a key aspect of what I've tried to do in Lincoln's Forgotten Ally is to challenge this most common way of remembering Joseph Holt's involvement in the investigation and trial of the Lincoln assassination conspirators. I should note, however, that at the same time I have consistently tried in the book to remain scrupulously true to the evidence that I find in the historical record, which is abundant, as I've already said, not least in terms of the distressing blunders Holt genuinely did make, including placing seemingly blind trust in a number of unequivocally corrupt witnesses in order to lay the foundation for his grand conspiracy theory, his case against Davis. Still, my reading of the evidence leads me to argue, often with some heat, that the record of Holt's performance as Judge Advocate General in the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's assassination is by no means a record of blunders only, or even predominantly. There was much, much more indeed that Holt did following Lincoln's murder that was right and certainly entirely defensible. Recognizing this, however, requires us to step back in time in order to grasp the mindset of this man who had struggled tirelessly at the nation's helm, as Holt had done, through the secession winter, through 4 years of incredibly bloody warfare, forsaking family, friends, and community of origin in order to defend the president, the Union, and the Constitution, in order to hold the United States together in the face of the Confederacy's treacherous, unrepentant rebellion. In Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, I have tried to clarify Holt's record and to correct the predominant historical memory of his actions in connection with the investigation and trials that followed the assassination of Lincoln. In addition, however, I have tried to tell the much larger, much more complex story of Holt's entire life and work, particularly his impressive work on the nation's behalf throughout his decades in Washington, so much of which has not been partly forgotten, but entirely forgotten. Even among enthusiastic students of the Civil War, for example, there are many who do not seem to remember or know that years before he became Lincoln's Judge Advocate General, Joseph Holt served as President James Buchanan's Commissioner of Patents, in which post he played a significant role protecting the intellectual property of the nation and of important individual inventors, Charles Goodyear among them. Then, beginning in early 1859, Holt became Buchanan's Postmaster General, a job that required him to grapple with numerous vexing and potentially explosive questions associated with maintaining a crucial national system of communication, itself a bond holding the nation together in the face of increasing and increasingly virulent sectional sentiment. Far more significant, in the final months of President Buchanan's administration, it was Joseph Holt who served as the floundering president's last Secretary of War, having accepted an emergency appointment to that position when the secessionist Virginian John B. Floyd became the third member of Buchanan's crumbling cabinet to resign in the wake of Abraham Lincoln's election and the subsequent secession of South Carolina. As Secretary of War between December 31st, 1860 and March 6th, 1861, Joseph Holt, whose devout, uncompromising unionism outweighed his commitment to his slaveholding heritage, strove courageously to hold the collapsing nation and the federal government together. As Secretary of War during the secession winter, Holt was called upon in a multitude of ways to respond as quickly, sternly, and effectively as he could to the steady secession of 6 additional states besides South Carolina, the withdrawal of their representatives and senators from Washington, the handing over to the rebels, sometimes by men still wearing the uniform of the U.S. Army, of federal properties located within the seceded states, and the exodus of hundreds of soldiers and U.S. Army officers to the South in contravention of their sworn oaths to defend the nation and its Constitution. It was Secretary of War Holt, too, who oversaw the sending of the first relief ship to Major Robert Anderson's aid at Fort Sumter, the Star of the West, which he sent in early January 1861, and which was forced to return north when it, like its successor, was fired on by South Carolina batteries already stationed in Charleston Harbor. It was Holt, as Secretary of War, who oversaw the buildup of defensive capabilities in the nation's capital during the early months of 1861 in order to forestall what was a much-feared Confederate invasion. And it was Joseph Holt who was ultimately responsible for President-elect Abraham Lincoln's safe arrival in the city and his successful and uneventful inauguration on March 4th. As the New York Herald declared 2 days after the inauguration, it was thanks in large part to Secretary of War Joseph Holt that a new administration is born, Brutus did not appear, and Abraham Lincoln lives in the White House. The New York Times agreed. It is to the bold patriotism of Mr. Holt, the Times insisted, that the country is indebted for the avoidance of the first bloody scene in the drama of the Secession Rebellion, the assassination or expulsion of President Lincoln from Washington, and the inauguration of a Southern military dictator in his place. Indeed, only after Lincoln had safely taken up residence in the Executive Mansion and appointed a new Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, did Holt resign his official post in the War Department. This period of Joseph Holt's service to the nation has been largely lost to our historical memory, and so has the fact that even after he handed the leadership of the War Department over to Secretary Cameron, the faithful Holt remained on duty in an unofficial capacity, prepared to assist Lincoln and his fledgling administration in any way that he could in order to defend the Union both men so dearly cherished. And this brings me to another important aspect of Holt's contribution to the nation's welfare that is rarely remembered, namely that for much of the war's first year, Holt served ex officio as Lincoln's chief advisor and point man on the situation in Kentucky, their shared state of birth, which was Jefferson Davis's birth state too. Indeed, throughout the spring, summer, and fall of 1861, Holt played a central role, perhaps the central role, in the federal government's efforts to keep the border state of Kentucky in the Union, despite the strong secessionist sentiment of many key individuals there, including the governor, Beriah Magoffin. Kentucky gone, Lincoln so famously wrote to Orville H. Browning as he considered the nation's vulnerability on the border between slavery and freedom. We cannot hold Missouri, nor, as I think, Maryland. These all against us, and the job on our hands is too large for us. We would as well consent to separation as at once, including the surrender of this capital. Joseph Holt agreed wholeheartedly with Lincoln, and as a result, he devoted enormous energy to preserving Kentucky's loyalty, traveling to the state to give a series of energetic and inspiring speeches on behalf of the Union, and arguing vehemently with any and all who suggested that Kentucky might do better to maintain an attitude of neutrality on the sectional dispute. To Holt, neutrality on the question of disunion was, as he put it, tantamount to being neutral in a contest between an officer of justice and an incendiary arrested in the attempt to fire the dwelling over a man's head. Holt's speeches in Kentucky and elsewhere rang with similar rhetoric, as did a pamphlet he published in collaboration with one of Lincoln's closest friends, Joshua Speed, of which tens of thousands of copies were disseminated throughout the state and across the nation that summer. At the same time, on an eminently practical level, and with Lincoln's quiet blessing, Holt and his pro-Union allies in the state also secretly saw to it that the loyal forces in Kentucky were armed with rifles, bayonets, and ammunition, whatever was necessary to defend their borders from Confederate incursions, and when it became necessary, to add their strength to the Union's effort to suppress the rebellion. In the end, of course, Kentucky did not secede, though slaveholders across the state energetically resisted the shift in the United States' war aims when in late 1862, those war aims came to include emancipation as well as the preservation of the Union. Indeed, some recent historians have argued that Kentucky can best be described as a Union state during the war, but a post-Confederate state after Appomattox. And there is considerable truth in this. Kentucky did not, it bears noting, ratify the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution ending slavery until 1976. That's 1976. Perhaps this helps in part to explain why, even in his home state of Kentucky, Holt's accomplishments on behalf of the Union are not more widely known or celebrated. These are just some examples of Holt's work on behalf of the nation during the Civil War era that have been largely obscured and that Lincoln's forgotten ally seeks to restore to our historical memory. But my study of Holt has other goals as well. For something else that I have tried to do in this book is simply be a good biographer of this important figure's long, full, but severely understudied life. And in this effort, I have taken vigorously to task the typical representations of Holt as a two-dimensional caricature I like to call revenge incarnate. In its place, I have tried to offer a much fuller portrait of him as the profoundly complex human being he truly was. Some readers of this book may reach the conclusion that they do not like Joseph Holt very much by the time they get to the last page. But I believe that even these readers will have to admit that Holt's long life offered the same complicated and often thorny mix of opportunities for laughter, anxiety, frustration, weariness, self-recrimination, anger, celebration, grief, and love, as all of ours do. Over the course of his amazingly rich and in some ways tragic 87-year-long life, Joseph Holt loved many times. He was married and widowed twice, both times to women to whom he was deeply devoted, but with whom he struggled mightily to negotiate the challenges of human intimacy. He had no children of his own, but he surely wished he had. Children seem to have loved him, and many friends, relatives, and strangers alike named their children after him. Holt also had a number of unwaveringly faithful friends over the course of his life, including former Postmaster General Horatio King, whose papers I've been examining today, the Reverend Howard Crosby, who was a prominent Presbyterian minister and theologian, and who also became the chancellor of the City University of New York, and Dr. Theodore S. Bell, a longtime professor of the theory and practice of medicine at the University of Louisville. Joseph Holt also had a number of truly venomous enemies, notably Jacob Thompson, with whom he had served in Buchanan's administration until Thompson resigned to support the Confederacy, and with whom Holt subsequently feuded for years, and of course Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor to the presidency. Holt also had 5 siblings, 4 brothers and 1 sister, the nearest and dearest of whom, his kind eldest brother, Richard, died when Holt was in his 20s. His little sister, Elizabeth, who loved him dearly and who I sometimes claim to be channeling, died during the war. His 3 surviving younger brothers, James, Thomas, and Robert, all became and remained staunch Confederates and proponents of slavery throughout the war and beyond Appomattox, as did the majority of his kin. In this light, it must be acknowledged that Joseph Holt's decision to stand by the Union and stand by Lincoln was a supremely costly one for him personally. It meant that he had to accept alienation, in many cases permanent alienation, from most of the people who had meant the most to him and whom he had loved the most for the first half-century of his life. This, it seems certain, is a price that few of us are willing to pay for any cause. The personal side of Joseph Holt's life story is fascinating and painful in its own right, and I have tried my best to offer a window into it. Finally, I have tried to shed light on one of the most interesting aspects of Holt's long, complicated, and poignant life story, a feature of his personal and professional development that deserves a great deal more attention than I have been able to devote to it at this point. What I refer to here is Holt's stunning transformation from being a Kentucky slaveholder and a passionate supporter of the pro-slavery Jacksonian Democratic Party in the first half of his life, to being an adamant supporter of emancipation, and beyond that, to Black Americans' civil and political rights in the second half. Holt's evolution on this score cannot by any means be interpreted as a foregone conclusion or as the inexorable result of the responsibility he had as Lincoln's Judge Advocate General for endorsing his boss's wartime policies. No, indeed. It is no secret that the history of the post-Civil War period is positively littered with the stories of individuals who supported both the Union and emancipation during the war and who then abandoned their concern for the former slaves in the war's aftermath. In contrast, Holt's determined support of emancipation and blacks' rights was an enduring result of his sharp realization that slavery was a corrupt and vile institution, which in turn grew into a realization that black people, slave and free, had the same natural rights as white people, and that those rights needed to be protected. In the second half of his life then, Joseph Holt fearlessly expressed these sentiments, despite the dismay they inevitably provoked among many of his friends and most of his kin. "Your faith in the African race is complete," wrote one woman friend with considerable disdain. "I think it will bring you but little happiness in this world." How the erstwhile slaveholder from Stephensport, Kentucky, ultimately became and remained one of the most ardently pro-black rights residents of the nation's capital is a story that deserves to be told, and I hope someday to be able to tell it. Indeed, some of the most profoundly moving documents I encountered while doing the research for Lincoln's Forgotten Ally were those I found containing Holt's legal opinions in connection with cases that crossed his desk at the Bureau of Military Justice involving black defendants. In the brutal years of and following the nation's dramatic and bloody struggle for survival, many of these black defendants were charged with violence, even murder sometimes, following long periods of unrelenting abuse by white men who considered themselves justified on the basis of their whiteness alone to treat black men and women however they saw fit. In not one of these cases, it was clear, did Holt agree with the white men's justifications for their abuse of these black men and women. Quite the contrary, in every case, he wrote vigorously on behalf of the black defendants, discussing at length and with tremendous eloquence the horrific system of racial injustice that blacks in America had been forced to endure for centuries. And while he did not celebrate or commend the individual black defendants' violent responses to the hideous abuses they had suffered at the hands of white men, Holt nevertheless focused on the corrupt and inhumane context out of which those responses had arisen. Moreover, Holt's deep commitment to black people's civil and human rights did not fade after Appomattox or after the ratification of the Great Reconstruction Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Indeed, it never faded, even as others around him who had once shared his commitment turned their attention to other things in the last half of the 19th century, things like sectional reconciliation, women's rights, the Indian Wars, industrialization, currency and the troubled economy, imperialism. Once he decisively rejected slavery, which was the central feature of the world from which he had come, and once he embraced with passion and supreme resolution Lincoln's vision for a new world in which all people could be free, Holt did not look back. I would be lying if I did not admit that this is one of the aspects of Joseph Holt's stories that enables me to forgive him some of his blunders and his flaws, and to seek to know him better and share his long-lost story with a larger world. Joseph Holt was not perfect by any stretch of anyone's imagination, but he certainly deserves a more favorable and more secure place in our historical memory than he has been accorded until now. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Are there questions? Yes.
I have to go back to the clemency petition.
Sure.
With Mary Surratt, where Holt maintained that he had shown it to Johnson and Johnson maintained he never saw it. What's your take on that?
My take is very strongly on the side of Holt because of a number of things. One is that Holt claimed to have showed the records to Johnson. Johnson did not claim that he hadn't seen it until 2 years later. It was only in 1867 during the John Surratt trial and his contest with Stanton that Johnson first raised this point. And although Johnson made this claim 2 years later, it is in fact the case that on the day of the execution, various newspapers published in major cities in the country knew about the clemency petition. And if the newspapers knew about the clemency petition, I can't imagine that Johnson didn't know about it. He must have seen it. I also think that Holt's own defense on this point is very persuasive to me. He said in his defense to Johnson, if in fact you knew in 1867 even that I had not shown you that clemency petition, you were duty bound to remove me from my office as Judge Advocate General for having violated my oath of office and violated my responsibility as the legal officer for the War Department. And Johnson didn't remove him from office. He never removed him from office, and he carried on till 1875, and I think that's a very persuasive argument. Plus, Holt, for all of his flaws, was very legalistic, and although I think it's possible that when he took the record of the case into Johnson, he didn't go, make sure you see on the back page the clemency. It's possible he didn't do that. Certainly he felt that those 8 people all should be convicted and hanged. I think it's impossible that he did not bring the entire record in with him. So that's my strong response to that question. Yes, in the back.
I have a question about his direct relationship with Mr. Lincoln. Was there a lot of correspondence? Did you run across that? And also, why did Lincoln replace him as Secretary of War at the very beginning of his first administration?
To your first question, I'll say that there is a tremendous amount of contact between Lincoln and Holt. Every capital case that first of all, Lincoln is the person who appointed him Judge Advocate General, and he selected Holt specifically and appointed him. He knew of his work, obviously. He appointed him in 1862, September of 1862. Already he'd known of his work in Buchanan's administration. He had been working with him through the first year or so of the war in keeping Kentucky in the Union. He appointed him. He knew him personally. They actually were born within about 100-mile. He, Jefferson Davis, and Lincoln, within about a 100-mile radius of one another. Once he was Judge Advocate General, every capital case, among others, that came before him had to be reviewed by the president. And he would come into Lincoln's office with, 70 cases they had to discuss together. They would sit together for hours at a time when Lincoln had the time to meet with him. I've been also this week down at the National Archives reading the letters sent by the Judge Advocate General during his time in office, and I would say at least 20% of them are letters directly from Holt to Lincoln. And in Holt's papers, there are also communications from Lincoln. So they had a tremendous amount of contact. As to why Lincoln replaced him, I think Lincoln, as certainly Team of Rivals and other books have suggested, was very thoughtful about how he put his cabinet together in terms of balance and, region and so on. I think he very much appreciated Holt's service as Secretary of War under Buchanan. But I think he had other plans for his own cabinet, and I think he had other plans for Holt as well. And it's quite possible that Holt indicated to him that he was not interested in that particular post. It would have been, and Holt was a Democrat, so he remained a Democrat his whole life. That might have also, although obviously Lincoln was willing to appoint Democrats, but there were a lot of different things going on. When he removed Cameron from office and was going to replace him, many people thought he would bring Holt back in then, but there's some indication that it was Holt who said, take Stanton. Holt and Stanton had worked together in the Buchanan administration and knew each other very well, and it looks like Holt directed him towards Stanton instead. And then Stanton may have been also instrumental in encouraging Lincoln to take Holt on as Judge Advocate General. But in any, and later on in 1864, Lincoln did offer Holt the position of Attorney General, and Holt turned it down. He said, I really am in the right spot, thank you, but I'm in the right spot doing what I'm doing now, so. Yeah.
Lincoln, in dealing with Kentucky and the other border states, developed proposals for compensated gradual emancipation. Did Holt play a role in Lincoln's development of those proposals, and did he take a position in Kentucky on whether Kentucky should go along with Lincoln's idea?
I have not seen any material that I recall relating directly to that issue. I think that it would have been likely that Holt would have supported such a position, however, this idea of compensated emancipation. He was very concerned about the potential impact of the Emancipation Proclamation on Kentucky. And in fact, Lincoln, when Fremont issued in August 1861, his proclamation about how all the slaves in my district are going to be free, Lincoln sent Holt to go talk to Fremont about that policy and to get him to back up from that position. I think that Holt being a Kentuckian, many of his friends being slaveholders, even his Unionist friends being slaveholders, he was very sensitive to that issue. So I would imagine that he supported the idea of compensated emancipation. But one of the things that I think, although I haven't yet, because I haven't found the documents where Holt, he doesn't have a diary, he didn't keep a journal, and the letters he sent out are dispersed all over the place, and they're hard to locate. I'm looking for those letters where he tells us how he made that shift from being a slaveholder to being an emancipation supporter. I have my suspicion. My suspicion is that he was always ambivalent about it. There's certainly some evidence, ambivalent about slavery. There's a lot of evidence of that in the records we do have. And I think that when the time came that slavery looked like it was going to be the cause for the destruction of the Union, he was able to throw it out. He said, and he clearly does say nothing is worth surrendering the Union for. Once he made that step and chose to stand for the Union and not for the slaveholding South, then I think all of his ambivalence about the institution as a whole was allowed to really flourish. But I don't have, I can't put those dots together concretely with evidence yet. That's my suspicion. Other questions? No questions about The Conspirator? Why I hate the film? Or did I already make that clear? Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll ask, did they contact you?
You betcha.
And clearly they didn't take their advice.
You betcha. They contacted me, and they contacted several people at the Surratt House and a number of other historians. They, in fact, sent me a copy of the script and asked for my opinion, and I gave them my opinion in great detail, and as did other people that I know. And they did make some corrections of truly outrageous things. And they got Holt's title right, finally. They had him as something else, I can't remember what. But in essence, the word was that Redford liked it the way it was written, and that's what they were going to go with. And that the history didn't really matter so much. What I find, one of the many things I find interesting is that the actual story is so good. I don't know why you need to distort it in this way for this film, because it's really a great, fascinating story. If you tell it truthfully, you don't have to distort it. But yeah, they had Mary Surratt dressing, they had Aiken, in the script, telling her when she came to court that she should wear one of the dresses of his fiance, which was this very low-cut, flowery dress, that she should wear that into court. And I thought, seriously? You think that he would have said that in 1865? Yeah, you wear the low-cut flowery dress. You know. It was crazy. And one of my favorite scenes, as someone who's done a lot of work on women's history and gender history, the term gender in our sort of common parlance today is really a product of the 1970s. It used to be a grammatical term. Then anthropologists sort of brought it forward as a term relating to the issue of, you know, social construction of gender, right? In the film, they have the clemency petition being discussed for Mary Surratt, and among these military officers, and one says, you know, we want to see her receive clemency on the basis of her age and her gender. Oh, please. But I'm a historian. Really, you can't take us to the movies. We're not good companions. Not to historical films. Yes?
You mentioned several times blunders that he made, and you mentioned one in the trial. Are there other blunders that significant that you care to share?
Well, I guess I would, the trials, and particularly the Sanford Conover fiasco, I mean, you know, he really was so determined to prove that Davis was guilty that I think he went off the rails in terms of his judgment with regard to people like Sanford Conover. And I guess that's the biggest real blunder I see in terms of his professional career. I think the part of him that makes him unlikable to a lot of people is sort of the part that you see when you look at the cover of the book. He was very, very stern. And he did have a hard time forgiving people he felt had done him wrong or had done great wrong in some ways. And so, for example, many of his his second wife's family was full of these prominent Confederate people. Senator David Yulee from Florida was, you know, his brother-in-law. He never forgave those people, and he was, you know, really hard. And that's sort of tough to deal with. I also find it very distressing, his relationship with his two wives. He loved them very much, but he was a solitary person in a very essential way, and his relationships with them were very painful. And so I wouldn't call that a blunder exactly, but it's a painful thing to watch, and I feel for him and for them. And you know, his wives don't say you're a terrible husband, and his, you know, the in-laws all thought he was great, but it's sort of painful to see. So it's those kinds of things that are. And he was tough. I mean, I like him, but I can see why people go, oh, how could you spend all those years hanging out with him, you know? But maybe it's because he's dead. He's, you know, I don't know if I could live with him. He's, you know, I can put him aside when I need to. There is, I will tell you, in the book, the cover is a picture of him that if you have ever seen him, you know, it's a familiar looking picture. If you open the book, the frontispiece is a portrait of Holt from when he was probably in his 30s, that descendants of his brother have this beautiful portrait of it. And, you know, many things I read about him in his young life talk about him being very striking, very handsome, very charismatic. And you look at the picture on the cover of the book and you think, who could have been, you know, drawn to him? He looks so scary and fierce. But if you look at the frontispiece, you can see that person. That portrait has never been seen before, and it's only because I was fortunate enough to get to know the descendants of his brother that I was able to get access to this portrait. And they, interestingly, his brother, from whom they descend, was a staunch Confederate, but they all grew up thinking of Joseph Holt as the hero of their family, and didn't understand why everybody who knew him didn't like him, you know, why he always got such a bum rap, so. Yes? Stanbury? Henry Stanbury?
Wrote the opinion justifying trying civilians by military commission, including Mary Surratt.
Oh, that's Lincoln, Speed, James Speed.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Did Holt play any role in that?
Well, he and James Speed were, you know, they grew up in Kentucky together. I mean, they didn't grow up together, but they had lived in Louisville. He knew James Speed very well. Certainly, Holt believed that military commissions were legitimate. I think that he would have, if Speed had come to him and said, well, what do you think? Obviously, Holt was eager to have this tried by a military commission over which he could have assert control, and he was in fact very disappointed that he couldn't do that with John Surratt 2 years later when peace had been declared and military commissions were no longer a possibility. But I don't think that Speed was influenced by Holt to make that decision. I think if you read Speed's argument, it's really quite persuasive. I mean, you could argue the other side too, but Speed's argument about the assassination and the state of Washington, the situation in Washington, D.C. at the time, and Lincoln being commander-in-chief, and, all of that stuff, it's a very persuasive argument. And I don't think, Holt later in his life tried very hard to get Speed to do something he wanted him to do, and Speed refused to do it. So I don't think he was easily pushed by... She sounded so disappointed to see me. So I don't think Speed was, pushed around by Holt. And I think the other thing to say, and this is not original to me, is that I don't think it really would have mattered what kind of trial those 8 people underwent, military commission or civil trial. I think the mood in the spring of 1865 was to hang him hot, convict him and hang him, in Washington. I don't think it would have made much of a difference. It makes a difference retrospectively, but or perhaps it does. But I think at that time, the results probably would have been very similar. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.